The low hum above my ceiling wasn't just annoying, it was suspiciously rhythmic, like a metronome designed by someone with no sense of peace. At first, I thought it was a dying AC unit or maybe some critters in the attic. But then, during a Zoom call with a government server on the other end, my signal dropped for exactly 6 seconds. That might not mean much to most people, but in my world, 6 seconds of interference could cost lives. That's when I stood up, calmly muted the call, and made my way to the attic ladder. What I found nearly made me laugh out loud, not because it was funny, but because the sheer audacity was almost cartoonish. There, drilled right into the support beam of my federal cyber monitoring site disguised as a suburban home, was a blinking Wi-Fi relay box stamped with a cheap HOA sticker. The cable ran out the window, across the roof, and down into a signal repeater that had been bolted to my chimney. I hadn't given permission. In fact, I hadn't even been notified. Someone had installed unauthorized broadcast hardware on the roof of a national security agency digital dead zone. Whoever did this didn't know they had just piggybacked onto the wrong roof. And I don't mean wrong in a legal sense. I mean wrong in the classified, eyes-only, black badge clearance kind of way. I climbed down, shut the attic hatch, and let the silence of my living room settle. My cat looked at me like I had just lost my mind. Maybe I had. Or maybe, after 5 years of maintaining cover in this HOA neighborhood as a mild-mannered IT consultant named Ben Carter, my cover was finally going to be tested. I walked into my office and opened the antique wooden cabinet that my neighbors always thought held whiskey or cigars. Inside was my real job, my secure laptop, biometric lock, a hardened satellite uplink disguised as a retro turntable, a counter-surveillance monitor that could pick up anomalies within a 400-meter radius. The moment I reconnected the system, red pings started lighting up across my proximity grid. The HOA's little science project was not only bouncing internet, it was sniffing. Metadata, frequency tagging, possibly even device mirroring. I was still calm, but now I was also amused. Somebody had told the HOA board that installing a Wi-Fi repeater would be good for the community. They'd somehow gotten it approved, climbed onto my roof without so much as a courtesy knock, and bolted a small-scale surveillance antenna into the center of a classified agency facility. I didn't want to go nuclear right away. That's not how I operate. Years in intelligence work had taught me one golden rule: let the enemy expose themselves. So I called the HOA president. Her name was Karen. Of course it was. Karen Billingsley, the kind of woman who ran her neighborhood like a cruise director on a power trip. I asked, very politely, if there had been any recent maintenance or installations related to community technology. She replied with a dramatic sigh and said, "Oh yes, we finally got that tower up. Isn't it great? We chose your house because it has the clearest line of sight and you weren't using your roof for anything anyway." I paused, letting her words dangle in the air. She went on to explain how it would boost speeds for all approved devices and reduce traffic on their private network during HOA meetings. I asked her if she had gotten my permission. She said, and I quote, "We assumed you wouldn't mind. You're just the IT guy, right?" I hung up before my sarcasm could turn into felony threats. I stared at my screen. I thought about the lengths I had gone to for this assignment. Years of clean cover, of playing nice at barbecues, of nodding along while people complained about trash bins and lawn height. And now, without knowing it, the HOA had not only jeopardized a federal listening post, they had exposed every device connected through their network to my servers. If any one of them sniffed too deep, it could trigger a counter-intrusion protocol that would flag my home as compromised. I had about 48 hours to get ahead of this. That night, I climbed onto the roof, flashlight taped red for night ops, and inspected the setup. The hardware wasn't cheap. Someone on their team knew what they were doing. The repeater box was commercial grade. Whoever installed it wasn't just boosting Wi-Fi. They were collecting usage stats. Possibly even browser metadata. I followed the cable all the way to the tower base, hidden behind a decorative trellis near the HOA clubhouse. It was broadcasting strong, but more importantly, it was inbound as well. I could tell by the signal frequency that someone had connected their admin console to it remotely within the last hour. Probably for testing. Probably without understanding the digital minefield they were playing in. Back inside, I built a digital honeypot. Fake files. Decoy folders. I named one NSA_internal_backup_2020, just to see if anyone would bite. I loaded it with nonsense. Reworded Wikipedia articles wrapped in scrambled file extensions, and one juicy-looking do-not-open.exe, buried 3 levels deep. The perfect bait. Then I reconnected their cable, plugged it into my sandbox network, and activated the honeypot. The next morning, I received a ping. Someone had tried accessing the NSA_internal_backup_2020 folder from an unregistered HOA IP address. They downloaded 2 fake PDFs and attempted to open the .exe. I tracked the MAC address to a generic HOA board-issued laptop, model Del Vostro. Not only had they connected illegally, they had interacted with what they thought was government data. If I had been anyone else, that laptop user might have just committed a federal crime. Instead, they had no idea they had triggered a silent tracer, and now every keystroke on that machine was being mirrored on my secure terminal. I leaned back in my chair, folded my arms, and stared at the live feed as the HOA board's system administrator unknowingly opened a spreadsheet labeled Resident Overuse Report. It contained names, browsing history, data consumption. They weren't just boosting Wi-Fi, they were charging residents based on how much they streamed. My quiet neighborhood, filled with retirees and toddlers on tablets, was being data-milked by an HOA surveillance op. And they had the nerve to call me just the IT guy. They wanted fast internet. I was about to show them speed, but not the kind they'd enjoy. They wanted data control. I was about to show them what a real cybersecurity lockdown felt like. They thought they knew networks. They didn't know that the one roof they chose just happened to be the most dangerous house in the entire state to mess with. And they had no clue that by the end of the week, the real authorities would be standing on their doorsteps, not with fines, but warrants. The next morning felt quieter than usual, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. The birds still chirped, sprinklers still ticked in rhythmic arcs across perfectly mowed lawns, but there was something in the air, a stillness just before a storm. I was sitting on my patio, sipping coffee and casually scanning the traffic from the honeypot server. The intrusions had increased. Multiple login attempts, multiple downloads. Someone on the HOA side had gotten curious, maybe even paranoid. I watched a new IP address emerge, a separate laptop entirely, attempting to open the same decoy folder labeled NSA_internal_backup_2020. They even ran a primitive decryption tool against one of the dummy files. It was amateurish, but persistent, like someone poking a sleeping lion without knowing it had teeth. The logs showed another MAC address matching a system tagged HOAK Billingsley laptop. I nearly spat my coffee. Karen herself had joined the digital treasure hunt. It was almost impressive in a twisted way. Karen, who once sent a community-wide email about the dangers of using non-approved garden gnomes, was now elbow-deep in spoofed files and proxy tunnels. I could practically picture her squinting at her screen, convinced she was uncovering some neighborhood conspiracy. And in a way she was, but not the one she thought. I decided it was time to make contact again, not directly, but through controlled escalation. If Karen wanted to play tech queen, I'd let her run her little kingdom right into the firewall. I drafted an anonymous email from a dummy account and sent it to the HOA board's group address. The subject line was simple: unauthorized surveillance system detected, urgent remediation required. The body of the message detailed suspicious network behavior, potential legal liability, and recommended immediate shutdown of the repeater node installed on my property. I even attached a spoofed notice from the Federal Communications Review Board, complete with a watermark and code that would appear legitimate if Googled. I knew they'd panic. That was the goal. Within an hour, Karen was outside, strutting up and down the sidewalk on her phone, voice loud and sharp. She was in full crisis mode, barking at someone named Derek from the HOA's tech support team. I kept my blinds angled just enough to observe. Derek arrived a short while later, nervous, holding a backpack that clearly had tools bulging from its side. They walked toward my house. I grabbed my tablet, tuned into my external security cam feed, and watched as Derek opened the panel on the base of the signal tower and started examining the connections. I heard Karen say something about getting ahead of it before it hits the news, and nobody's going to jail over Wi-Fi. Derek looked visibly uncomfortable, but still kept working. Eventually, she turned toward my door and knocked. I answered with the most neutral expression I could manage. She smiled stiffly and said, "Hi Ben, we're just doing a little maintenance. Should be quick. Just a firmware update on the booster tower." I nodded slowly, pretending I didn't already know about her attempts to decode fake NSA data. I asked her if they had finally realized it was a bad idea to install equipment without permission. She waved her hand dismissively and said, "Oh, it's all community property, you know the bylaws. Technically your roof is shared elevation if it serves communal benefit." I fought the urge to laugh. She genuinely believed that nonsense. Or worse, she knew it was garbage and thought she could gaslight me into accepting it. Derek, for all his nervous fidgeting, was more interesting. He was sweating, even though it was barely warm outside. I could tell he was worried. Maybe he saw the tracer logs, maybe he knew they'd gone too far. I asked if they needed power access inside. Karen said no, everything was self-sufficient. I gave her a polite smile and closed the door. Then I went straight to my terminal and watched. Derek had connected a laptop to the control node. I scanned the packet logs. He was trying to erase logs. Smart move if he wasn't so painfully slow about it. I mirrored the deletion sequence in real time, saving a copy of every wiped file and mapping them to timestamps and MAC addresses. Evidence nice and tidy. By mid-afternoon, the tower was still operational, but the connection speed had slowed. Karen likely ordered a partial shutdown to save face while keeping the illusion of control. That was her pattern. Assert dominance until the panic passes, then pretend it was all a misunderstanding. Unfortunately for her, I'd already triggered the second phase of my plan. The honeypot was now baited with a new file, NSA Satellite Relay Zones Level 4 Clearance. Buried within it was an encrypted trigger that, when opened, would send an automated report to 3 federal monitoring offices with an attached location signature and evidence hash. That evening, just after sundown, someone accessed the new file. The flag was tripped. The system logged the user, HOA_TechAdmin01. The internal map blinked once. Alert dispatched. My job wasn't to arrest anyone, but I was required to report digital intrusion on federal monitoring points. That signal was enough to raise questions at the agency level, and once the IP address resolved to a residential community HOA, the protocol demanded verification. I knew what would happen next. I just had to sit back and let the storm form. The next day began with silence. Not the usual kind, but the eerie, heavy quiet that precedes something loud. I was watering my front lawn when I noticed a black SUV slowly turning into the cul-de-sac. Then another. They parked near the community center. Men in plain suits stepped out, no flashy badges, just calm confidence. They looked around, made a call, and entered the HOA office. I smiled faintly. They wouldn't say much. Just enough to stir discomfort. Just enough to let Karen know she'd been seen. Half an hour later, she emerged, face pale, hair a bit less perfect than usual. She clutched her phone like it might bite her. She was whispering urgently to someone, but the tremble in her voice carried across the lawn. I had a good guess what she was saying. I imagined phrases like, "No, I didn't know," but it was just for Wi-Fi. I finished watering, turned, and walked inside. The agents wouldn't out me. That wasn't how the NSA operated. I was just a helpful neighbor with a nice roof. And Karen? She was now the president of the most closely watched HOA in the state. That evening, I checked the signal logs. The tower had gone dark. Derek's access credentials had been wiped. Karen's laptop hadn't pinged in 12 hours. But the best part? Someone had tried to unplug the honeypot manually. That only triggered the backup monitor, which captured one last log entry from a device tagged board chair KB. Karen's personal machine had auto-synced with the decoy database one final time. This time, just long enough to activate an internal screenshot protocol. She didn't just tamper. She documented herself doing it. The story was no longer about a Wi-Fi tower. It was about intent, about abuse of access, and about one woman's inability to respect the limits of her authority. And I, the quiet IT guy she thought she could walk all over, was the one who'd engineered her downfall with nothing more than patience, precision, and a keyboard. Night brought with it a familiar calm, but underneath it buzzed the tension of an active operation. I stayed inside, lights off, my terminal screen illuminating the dark room with soft flashes of green and red as log events updated in real time. Everything had been copied, time-stamped, and forwarded to secure NSA cloud servers. My side of the board was clean. The real storm, however, had just started brewing on the HOA's end. The signal tower was now a digital corpse, silent and disconnected, yet every footprint it left behind remained intact, frozen in the chain of evidence. The tracer logs had been accepted by the field office's preliminary review team, and though my report was officially classified, I received a quiet confirmation via secure channel. External units were now involved. That meant I needed to maintain distance, act like I knew nothing, and observe. It also meant Karen was going to start unraveling fast. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. The sight of unmarked black SUVs had spooked the neighbors. Some thought a drug bust had happened. Others speculated about a political scandal. A few even asked if the clubhouse had been raided over financial fraud. I walked outside with my coffee, gave polite nods, and let the rumors swirl. I didn't confirm or deny anything. Karen, however, had lost all control of the narrative. She paced the sidewalk in front of the HOA office like a nervous suspect on a cop show. Her designer sunglasses couldn't hide the exhaustion on her face. She looked like she hadn't slept, and that was probably true. Her little surveillance project, her digital side hustle, had turned into a federal embarrassment in less than 72 hours. I watched from across the street as she barked into her phone again, this time with desperation in her tone. I caught fragments of her words. Legal team, data wipe, lawsuit, liability, all scrambled into the frantic blur of someone trying to build a lifeboat on a sinking ship. But there was no lifeboat. Not anymore. She was already inside the system, her digital fingerprints smeared all over the bait files, login attempts, and unauthorized access points. What she didn't know was that the final nail hadn't even dropped yet. That would come soon enough. Around noon, I received a secure message from an agent flagged only by a call sign I recognized from previous fieldwork. It was a one-liner. Local authority approval granted. Proceed as brief. Sweep begins 0800 next. Translation: I had until tomorrow morning to initiate the isolation and takedown protocol, supported by both federal and local agencies. That gave me the rest of the day to make sure the tower's influence was nullified and to finish pulling the last threads out of the HOA's digital mess. I knew Karen would make a move before then. She had to. People like her don't go down quietly. They try to salvage power by any means necessary, even if it means doubling down on lies. That move came faster than I expected. Around 3 p.m., there was a knock at my door. Not aggressive, not hesitant, controlled, rehearsed. I opened it to find Karen standing with a legal-looking man in a cheap suit and an uncomfortable smile. She introduced him as Mr. Rollins, legal counsel for the HOA. I stepped aside politely, letting them both in without comment. I didn't need to provoke anything. I just needed them to speak, and they did. Karen launched into a pre-written explanation about unfortunate misunderstandings, claiming there had been no intention of data collection, that the equipment installed was purely for communal benefit, and that if any files were mistakenly accessed, it was because their software had misinterpreted metadata packets. Mr. Rollins nodded through the whole monologue like a man paid not to think. I offered no expressions, just let them speak until they felt they had the upper hand. Then I simply asked Karen one question. Did you personally access a folder named NSA_internal_backup_2020 on a shared network node connected to the repeater? Her mouth froze mid-sentence. Mr. Rollins looked at her, confused. She stammered, then tried to pivot, claiming she saw something weird and clicked it without knowing what it was. That was all I needed. I opened my laptop and showed them the timestamp logs, the IP addresses, the screen captures. I didn't show the agency badge or mention my clearance. I didn't need to. The proof was right there. Karen's face drained of color. Mr. Rollins's mouth went dry. He started sweating, scanning the screen like it might reveal a loophole he could jump through. I let the silence simmer until Karen finally asked what I wanted. That's when I made it clear. I didn't want anything. No money, no apology, no negotiations. I was merely informing them that a federal investigation had already begun and that the tampering of federal cyber infrastructure came with automatic legal consequences. If she had anything else to confess, now would be the time. They left in silence. No threats, no denials, no declarations of innocence. Just the shuffle of feet retreating across my porch like children leaving the principal's office after a suspension. As the door closed, I sat down and began encrypting the final report for the field team. The timeline was set. Karen had chosen to play defense, which only made it worse. If she had come clean, shown remorse, maybe blamed it all on Derek, she might have had an angle. But now she was officially the face of the operation. An HOA president turned unlicensed data pirate, scrambling to save a sinking board. That evening, I watched as HOA workers removed the tower panels, probably under Karen's panicked orders. They unscrewed repeaters, disconnected routers, and carried equipment into the clubhouse garage. But it was far too late. The agents had already cloned the drives, traced the login histories, and gathered everything they needed. All Karen had done was destroy the cosmetic evidence, leaving the real digital skeletons behind for the authorities to pick apart piece by piece. Around midnight, I received one last alert. Karen's laptop pinged the honeypot again. An automatic system update tried to resync her files. It failed, but not before logging her latest device activity. She had opened a document titled HOA_fines_refund_policy, likely preparing her next strategy. Buy silence, offer refunds, and hope it all faded. It wouldn't. Nothing fades once it hits the federal logs. She was beyond the point of damage control. She was now a subject of interest in a federal breach case. I shut down my system and leaned back in my chair. The operation had gone smoother than I expected. My cover still held. No one in the neighborhood suspected me of being anything more than the quiet guy with the neat lawn and really fast internet. But Karen? Her empire of lawn notices, architectural committee memos, and petty fines had collapsed in real time, and she didn't even understand the full scope of it yet. Tomorrow would change everything. Not just for her, but for the entire HOA board. They thought they were playing with signals and networks. They didn't realize they had walked into a digital minefield. And now, the final sweep was coming. The morning began before the sun even touched the edges of the rooftop. I was already dressed, already logged in, already in the zone. The agents had confirmed the sweep was greenlit and scheduled to begin within the hour. My role from this point forward was strictly observational, eyes, ears, and backup if necessary. I wasn't to interfere, not unless the situation escalated. But deep down, I knew there would be no need for intervention. Karen and her board had already built the stage, lit the spotlights, and stepped onto it with both feet. Now the curtain was just waiting to fall. I stepped out onto the porch as two plain black utility vans rolled slowly into the neighborhood. They didn't have logos or flashing lights. They didn't need them. These were the quiet types, well-trained federal tech response teams who specialized in digital forensics and field retrieval. They weren't here to knock on doors or flash badges. They were here to clean up and collect. And the first stop was the community center where Karen had stashed the disassembled tower hardware. A few minutes later, two more sedans followed. They stopped near the clubhouse, agents stepping out wearing nondescript polos and slacks, like IT consultants or building inspectors. Except these consultants carried encrypted data cases and wore biometric wristbands. Across the street, Karen emerged from her home in a bathrobe, hair still pinned from whatever restless sleep she tried to get. Her eyes widened as she saw the vans. She clutched her phone, started dialing frantically, then changed her mind and approached the agents instead. From my porch, I couldn't hear what she said, but her arms were flailing in that desperate way people move when they're trying to prove they're innocent by sheer volume. One of the agents showed her a piece of paper. She stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes dropped to the document and stayed there, scanning each line as if hoping to find a line that would make the problem go away. There wasn't one. She tried to protest again, but it didn't matter. The agents didn't need her consent. The warrant had been processed through both federal and municipal channels. What Karen didn't realize was that in her efforts to weaponize data against her own community, she had unintentionally pulled government intelligence infrastructure into her playground. And now the grown-ups had arrived to take their toys back. From where I stood, I could see her shoulders sink. The fight had drained from her. The denial had burned out. She wasn't even angry anymore. She was terrified. When one of the agents gestured toward the clubhouse, she nodded silently and walked with them, her bathrobe dragging slightly behind her like a deflated flag. Inside, they began the sweep. My own system flagged their activity as it started. Non-invasive wireless scans, device pings, and network signal probing. Every device within a 2-block radius was being identified and logged. All of it invisible to the average resident. But I saw it all happening in real time on my secondary screen. They weren't just looking for the tower data. They were checking for any rogue access points, duplicate routers, unauthorized backup. What Karen had started as a signal booster project had turned into a full-scale digital investigation. I watched as Derek, the tech guy, was summoned from his home by a uniformed HOA officer. He looked half-dressed, wearing gym shorts and a wrinkled shirt. His face turned pale when he saw the agent. Unlike Karen, he didn't try to talk. He just walked over and sat down on the clubhouse steps with his head in his hands. He knew. He wasn't stupid. Maybe in over his head, yes, but not stupid. He had tried to erase logs, tried to backtrack, tried to play technician in a world of spies and encrypted tunnels. And now, he was just waiting for the hammer to drop. By noon, the sweep had expanded. The agents had begun collecting HOA laptops, hard drives, tablets, even a few router boxes from board member homes. I saw one board member try to argue at their doorstep. An older man named Phil who once fined me for leaving my trash can out for 6 extra minutes. He waved his hands, raised his voice, but in the end, the agents remained calm and walked past him. They were backed by lawful authority, and Phil's outrage meant nothing when stacked against federal digital policy violations. Throughout the day, the neighborhood buzzed with whispered conversations and long stares. People stood on porches pretending to garden or sip tea while trying to figure out what was going on. I overheard one neighbor ask another if they thought the HOA had been hacked. Another neighbor suggested it might be about embezzled funds. No one got it right. Not even close. And I wasn't about to tell them. Let them wonder. Let Karen explain it when this all blew over, if it ever did. Karen, for her part, stayed mostly inside after the initial sweep. I saw her once more around 3 in the afternoon, sitting in her car with the engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't crying. She was just frozen. Like her mind had finally caught up with the situation and realized the scale of the disaster. She had violated not just ethical boundaries, but federal laws. Her little power trip had become a case file. Her HOA presidency was now a cautionary tale in someone's cybersecurity manual. By dusk, the agents wrapped up the physical sweep. I received one last coded message, confirmation that the extracted data had been secured, encrypted, and forwarded to the NSA's Forensics Division. I shut down my external monitors and powered off the relay server. My home returned to its civilian disguise. To everyone else, I was just a quiet guy who liked his privacy. And I would keep it that way. But before the night ended, I took one more walk. Just around the block. Nothing dramatic. Just a casual stroll past the clubhouse and down toward the cul-de-sac. As I passed Karen's house, I noticed something missing. Her HOA president lawn plaque, once proudly posted beside her porch, had been removed. In its place was a patch of fresh dirt. I smiled faintly. The cleanup had begun. As I rounded the corner, a few kids were playing basketball in a driveway, laughing without a care in the world. Their Wi-Fi probably still worked fine, now routed through normal channels again. No more surveillance. No more rate throttling. No more secret tracking. They didn't know it, but the digital leash had been cut. And it felt good. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars peek out, I thought about how absurd it was that a Wi-Fi tower could bring down a local tyrant. But it wasn't about the tower. It was about trust, about boundaries, and about what happens when small people with unchecked power forget that some of us are quietly watching, not out of paranoia, but because it's our job. Tomorrow, the HOA would wake up to a changed reality. Karen might still cling to whatever scraps of authority she had left, but her reign was over. And me? I'd go back to being the guy with the tidy hedges and the suspiciously strong internet signal. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's just quiet enough for only the right people to hear. The sun rose slowly the next morning, spilling a warm orange light over a neighborhood that looked the same on the surface but was now very different underneath. The silence that lingered wasn't the usual peaceful quiet of a suburban morning, it was the kind of stillness that followed a storm no one saw coming. The clubhouse remained locked, a temporary notice taped to the doors with vague wording about technical maintenance and document audits. No one was buying it. Everyone had seen the unmarked vans. Everyone had noticed the agent. And most importantly, everyone had noticed that Karen hadn't made a single appearance since the previous afternoon. For a woman who usually sent out 3 emails a day and walked the neighborhood like a queen inspecting her kingdom, her sudden disappearance was more than suspicious, it was damning. I watched from my porch again, as I had for most of the week, coffee in hand, cat at my feet, playing the role of passive observer. A few neighbors strolled by and offered me polite nods, their expressions filled with questions they were too afraid to ask. Some waved nervously, others didn't meet my gaze at all, perhaps wondering if I knew more than they did. I did. Much more. But that wasn't for them to know. My part was almost done. The operation was complete. The data had been swept, the equipment confiscated, and the key offenders flagged for further action. All that remained now were the ripples of consequence. Around mid-morning, a black SUV rolled up again, this time stopping directly in front of Karen's house. 2 agents stepped out, one holding a small case, the other carrying a document envelope. There were no dramatics, no drawn weapons, no shouting. Just a firm knock on her door and a conversation too quiet for anyone else to hear. She stepped outside after a few moments, dressed sharply this time, hair done, posture stiff. She didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. She read the papers, nodded occasionally, then turned back into the house while the agents waited. When she returned, she handed over a laptop and a mobile device. The agents thanked her and walked back to the vehicle. No handcuff, no public spectacle, just a silent extraction of evidence and a slow drive back down the street. It was surgical, precise, and final. That was the end of her digital authority. The last tools she had used to control, monitor, and manipulate the neighborhood were now in someone else's hands. And she knew it. Her expression, once filled with smugness and control, was now distant. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't wave. She simply closed the door behind her and let the world outside move on without her. Within an hour, her name was removed from the HOA website. Her access credentials revoked. Her reign as president was done, not through a vote but through collapse. What followed in the days after was a blend of confusion and cautious optimism. The rest of the HOA board, now terrified of their own involvement being investigated, hastily appointed a temporary president, Mrs. Carmichael, a retired schoolteacher who had spent most of her life trying to avoid drama and politics. She sent out a community-wide message promising transparency and repair. That alone earned her more goodwill than Karen had collected in 3 years. The clubhouse reopened under tight oversight, and residents were allowed to view logs of past fines and violations. What they discovered was infuriating. Dozens of residents had been charged inflated penalties based on digital monitoring. One neighbor had been fined 3 separate times for streaming excess bandwidth, even though he didn't own a TV. Another had been threatened with disconnection unless they paid a mysterious tech usage fee that was never officially voted on. The outrage was immediate. Several homeowners banded together to file a collective grievance against the HOA board. Refund demands flooded in. Lawsuits were mentioned. Local news picked up the scent of controversy and started circling the story like vultures. Karen tried to lay low, but it was too late. Her name was now attached to every shady decision, every unexplained fine, every privacy breach. She stopped showing her face entirely. Curtains drawn. Porch light off. For a woman who had once dictated the color of every mailbox on the street, it was a spectacular fall. But even as justice began taking form in the open, the real victory remained quiet and unnoticed. The surveillance system that had once fed on the neighborhood's data had been dismantled from the inside. The fake files, the bait folders, the honeypots, all of it had done their job. I had traced every keystroke, every login, every abuse of power, and packaged it neatly for the agency. My report had already been archived. The evidence would live on permanently in federal records. Karen's face, along with her access history, her emails, and her pathetic attempts at deletion, were all sealed away where they belonged. She might avoid arrest for now, but the stain would follow her. Her future HOA applications would be flagged. Any attempt to involve herself in public administration would trigger background hit. She had become a silent example of what happens when petty power runs into real accountability. As for me, I began wrapping up my work. The temporary rig in my basement was broken down. The secondary relay nodes were pulled. I scrubbed the network logs, triple-wiped the decoy server, and returned the house to its usual, unassuming setup. My role here was finished. I'd lived in the neighborhood long enough to complete the assignment. Now it was time to rotate out, hand the location off to the next agent on the list, and move on to the next hotspot. The agency always had a few in the pipeline. Some were international, some were domestic, but all of them required one thing above all else: patience. Before I left, I took one final walk through the community. The kids were back on their bikes, the barbecues were warming up again, and neighbors were no longer looking over their shoulders. The HOA office now had a new front window with a welcome sign instead of a warning, and Mrs. Carmichael had personally thanked me for being so understanding during the technical chaos. I simply smiled and told her the internet should run better now. As I packed my last box into the back of the car, my cat curled into his travel crate with practiced ease. He, like me, had grown used to moving without leaving a trace. The neighbors waved as I pulled out of the driveway. Some looked genuinely sad to see me go. Others were probably relieved. Either way, they'd never know the real reason I came or the quiet war that had taken place just beneath their noses. In the rearview mirror, the neighborhood shimmered in the afternoon sun, peaceful and reset. And just as I turned onto the main road, I spotted Karen's figure in her front window, still watching, still wondering. But this time, she wasn't in control. She wasn't feared. She wasn't respected. She was just another resident, trapped inside a story she had written for herself and never thought would be read. And somewhere deep in a secure federal server, her chapter had already been archived under one of the quietest operations of the year. No headlines, no arrests, just a simple file name. HOA_Karen_incident_complete.